In the middle of a police station lobby, the punch from Sergeant Vance Harlan split Silas Kane's lip open, but the federal agent did not fall, and he did not flinch. The station erupted in laughter as Harlan snatched the badge wallet from his hand, called it a cheap fake, and ordered two officers to cuff the man he assumed was an impersonator. Silas only glanced at his watch and said, in a voice too calm for the room, that they had just triggered a lockdown. A hard mechanical click rolled through the building. The front door sealed, the garage bay sealed, the evidence room light flipped from green to red, and a voice came through every speaker in the building announcing that a federal search order was now in effect. If you want to watch an arrogant man lock himself inside a building full of his own evidence, stay with this story and hit subscribe to see exactly how far the fall goes. Rain had been falling in a thin gray sheet over Westbridge, an aging industrial city in Pennsylvania where the police department occupied a squat brick building that had not been renovated in decades. Silas arrived in an unmarked sedan with a dent in the rear bumper, wearing a plain dark jacket instead of a suit, carrying no escort and no visible badge. He had learned, across many investigations, that the moment a federal office announced its arrival in advance, the paper trail he needed had a way of disappearing before he ever reached the door. He carried a sealed envelope, a department phone, and a plain leather case with no markings of any kind. The officer working the front desk looked him over slowly and asked whether he was there to apply for a maintenance position or drop off paperwork for someone else. Silas introduced himself calmly, asked to speak with Chief Brennan Crow, and stated that he represented a federal agency without offering further detail. The desk officer did not check his credentials against any system. Instead, he picked up a phone and called down Sergeant Vance Harlan, whose footsteps arrived before his voice did, trailed by a knot of younger officers already grinning at whatever joke had been passed between them. Harlan made a point of leaving Silas standing in the middle of the open lobby in full view of the bullpen, the way a man might position someone he intended to interrogate rather than assist. When Silas extended his credentials, Harlan glanced at them for less than a moment and never reached for the scanner mounted on the counter beside him. He mocked the sedan parked outside, mocked the plain jacket, and told the room that real agents did not usually look like they had wandered off a construction site. Silas said nothing in response, letting his eyes move instead across the ceiling, tracking a security camera above the hallway that had been rotated several degrees off its normal angle, exactly as a contact inside the building had warned him it would be. He touched the face of his watch but did not press it yet, giving Harlan one last opportunity to do the simple, correct thing and verify who was standing in front of him. Then Harlan's eyes dropped to the corner of the envelope in Silas's hand where a single name was visible in block letters, and something behind his expression shifted before he could stop it. Silas had spent the better part of his career learning to read rooms exactly like this one, the kind of building where authority moved less through official rank and more through who was allowed to raise their voice without consequence. He had grown up in a household where his father, a postal worker for decades, taught him that composure was not weakness, but a form of leverage most people never learned to use. That lesson carried him through law school, through a brief and difficult stint as a local prosecutor, and finally into federal service, where he discovered that patience solved cases faster than confrontation ever did. He had walked into buildings like Westbridge many times over the years, buildings that wore a friendly face for cameras and reporters while quietly running a very different set of rules behind closed doors. What made this one different was the file sitting inside his sealed envelope, a file that had taken months to build and could still collapse if he moved even slightly too fast. That name belonged to Amos Carver, and the moment Harlan read it, his posture changed from performative authority into something tighter and more defensive. He demanded to know why a stranger was walking into his station carrying a folder connected to a man he clearly recognized. Silas declined to explain the contents, asking only that Harlan place a call to the federal prosecutor's office to confirm his identity before this went any further. Instead of making that call, Harlan reached out and pulled the badge wallet directly from Silas's hand, turning it upside down and reading the title aloud incorrectly, asking the officers around him if it looked like something ordered off the internet. A few of the younger officers laughed along, eager to stay on the right side of a man who clearly ran this floor. Silas warned, without raising his voice, that detaining the credentials of a federal agent could constitute obstruction. A warning Harlan immediately twisted into a threat against police officers, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. He ordered Silas toward the intake area for a pat-down and reached for the leather case, which Silas refused to surrender, explaining that its contents were sealed under a federal court order. Harlan ordered two officers forward anyway, and when Silas asked whether he was being detained or arrested, no one in the room offered a lawful basis for either. Lieutenant Elise Marin crossed the lobby at that moment, noticed the tension immediately, and suggested they verify the credentials with the issuing office before anything escalated further. Harlan waved her off, reminding her sharply that this was his shift and his call to make. Near the end of the hallway, Silas spotted a civilian employee named Lena Pierce standing very still, her hand wrapped tightly around a ring of keys, trying and failing to look like she was simply passing through. When Harlan's attention drifted toward her as well, Silas understood immediately that his presence in the building had just placed her at risk, since anyone watching closely could see the two of them were not strangers. Beneath the sleeve of his jacket, he pressed a hidden control on his watch that sent a preliminary alert, not yet the full lockdown signal, but enough to tell a federal team stationed nearby that conditions inside the building were deteriorating. Outside, an operations unit already monitoring the camera feeds began preparing the legal trigger that would let them seal the building the instant probable cause existed. Harlan stepped in close enough that his voice dropped into something meant only for Silas, telling him plainly that he ought to understand his place and stop assuming a counterfeit badge would make anyone in this building call him an agent. Silas answered so quietly that only the officers nearest him could hear it, saying he did not need Harlan to call him anything at all. He only needed him to keep talking. Harlan ordered him to place both hands against the wall, and Silas complied without resistance, though he asked calmly and clearly for Harlan to state the legal basis for the arrest directly into the nearest camera. Harlan moved closer instead, using his height and volume the way he always had, accusing Silas of impersonating a federal officer, trespassing inside a secure facility, and carrying stolen documents. Silas reminded him once more that a single phone call to the federal prosecutor's office would resolve every accusation in under a minute, and Harlan still refused to make that call because some part of him already understood that the envelope in Silas's hand was connected to a case he could not afford to have examined. He reached instead for the leather case, trying to pull it free, and Silas held the strap firmly without striking back, repeating only that the documents inside were protected by a federal court order. Harlan lost whatever restraint remained and threw a closed fist into the side of Silas's face, splitting his lip and rocking his head sideways, though his footing never left the ground beneath him. For a few seconds, the entire lobby fell silent, and one young officer laughed nervously, mistaking the punch for a display of dominance that had settled the matter. Harlan ordered Silas cuffed and every device on him confiscated, and Elise Marin objected immediately, demanding they pause everything until his identity could be confirmed through the proper channel. Harlan told her flatly to be quiet and warned that continued interference would be documented as insubordination on her permanent record. As two officers stepped forward to restrain him, Silas held the side control on his watch for several seconds, sending his location, a live audio feed, and the exact moment of the strike directly to a federal server outside the building. He looked at Harlan without anger and told him, almost gently, that he had just triggered the lockdown himself. Within seconds, every electronic lock in the building shifted state at once, sealing the front doors, the garage bay, the elevators, and every hallway requiring restricted access, while emergency exits remained operable but were flagged and monitored by agents stationed outside. And the internal network dropped into a read-only mode that no one inside could override. The evidence room locked automatically and its records began copying themselves onto an indefensible server no one in the building could reach. A calm, controlled voice came through the public address system belonging to federal prosecutor Tessa Harlow, instructing every person in the building not to delete data, leave their post, or touch the evidence room since a federal search order was now in full effect. Harlan still insisted this had to be some kind of hoax or a cyber attack aimed at the department and demanded the control room reopen the doors immediately, only to be told by a stunned technician that the city's own security network had already transferred full authority to a federal judge's order hours earlier. Silas asked, without raising his voice, to have the cuffs removed. And when Harlan refused, Elise Marin walked over and unlocked them herself. Harlan tried to stop her, and for the first time that morning, the officers standing around him did not move to obey his order. Silas took his credentials back, wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, and read his full name, rank, and case number aloud for the record, revealing that he was the unseen supervisor for a federal operation codenamed Glass House. The investigation had been running for months, tracking dozens of arrests across the city that showed signs of fabricated or planted evidence. The envelope Harlan had tried to seize did not contain the full case file at all, only a formal order to preserve records, since the actual documentation already sat safely inside a federal courthouse. Outside, the control team released the doors from their end, and Tessa Harlow walked in first, followed by financial investigators, digital forensic specialists, and evidence preservation officers, none of them raising a weapon or shouting a single order. Every officer in the room was simply asked to set down their sidearms and step away from their terminals. And most of them did so within seconds. Tessa studied the cut on Silas's lip and immediately instructed her team to add a charge of assaulting a federal officer and obstruction of justice to the growing file. Harlan began to understand, slowly and with visible dread, that a single punch had converted a quiet, careful investigation into something the department could never again bury or explain away. Then the door to the chief's office opened and Brendan Crowe stepped out with practiced composure, looking past Harlan toward the federal agents filling his lobby, and asked his sergeant in a voice meant to sound concerned exactly what he had just done. Crowe shook hands with Tessa immediately, apologized to Silas with a rehearsed sincerity, and announced loudly that Harlan's conduct did not reflect the values of his department. He ordered Harlan's weapon confiscated on the spot, a gesture designed purely to make himself appear cooperative in front of the cameras now recording everything. Harlan stood frozen, stunned that the man who had shielded him for years was now positioning him as the sole person responsible for everything that had happened. Silas did not argue the point, choosing instead to ask Crowe evenly how he had known with such precision exactly which records this federal operation had come looking for. Crowe claimed it was only an educated guess based on years of experience running the department. Meanwhile, the forensic team accessing the server discovered an automated deletion command that had been scheduled only minutes earlier, tied directly to an administrator account belonging to the chief's own office. Crowe insisted his credentials could easily have been compromised by someone else inside the building and tried to delay further questioning by invoking his union representative and the mayor's office. Tessa informed the room that outbound communication was restricted for the moment, though every person present retained the right to contact counsel through a monitored line. Crowe offered with practiced warmth to let Silas leave and treat his injury before continuing, a suggestion Silas declined immediately, recognizing it for the delay tactic it was. Lena Pierce was escorted to a secured room under the protection of two federal agents, and when Harlan caught sight of her being led away, his expression made it obvious he suspected she was the source of the leak. He shouted that she had betrayed what he called the family of this department, and Silas answered simply that a family does not require its members to protect crimes committed against strangers. Lena placed a small storage drive on the table in front of Tessa and said quietly that this was not the first time the chief had ordered department data destroyed. Lena had worked inside that evidence room for years, long enough to know every drawer, every logbook, and every quiet habit of the officers who came and went through its narrow doorway. She first noticed something wrong months earlier when a routine inventory count came up short on an item she distinctly remembered logging herself. A discrepancy she initially dismissed as her own clerical error. When the same kind of discrepancy appeared a second time, then a third, she began keeping a private notebook at home, writing down dates and item numbers in handwriting small enough to fit on index cards she kept tucked inside a cookbook on her kitchen shelf. She never told a single coworker what she suspected. Terrified that the wrong person overhearing even a passing remark could cost her a job she genuinely needed to support her two children. It was only after a chance encounter with one of Silas's contacts, a former Westbridge officer who had left the department years earlier under circumstances no one liked to discuss, that Lena found a way to pass what she knew to someone she believed might actually act on it. Lena explained that the camera failures officers had long attributed to faulty wiring were not accidental at all. Since Harlan routinely requested the hallway cameras disabled on the same nights, certain evidence went missing from storage. Without altering any video footage, she had quietly built a separate access log that recorded exactly who entered the evidence room and when. A record Harlan had never known existed. That log showed Harlan accessing the evidence room shortly before numerous documented complaints involving arrests that were later challenged in court. In the case tied to Amos Carver specifically, a sealed bag was removed from storage in the middle of the night, and by sunrise, that same bag with its seal number, quietly altered, had appeared inside Amos's vehicle during a traffic stop. Crowe argued that a digital log could easily be falsified by anyone with basic technical skill. Silas answered by laying a second independent layer of evidence on the table, traffic camera footage from directly outside the station showing Harlan's personal vehicle leaving the garage during that exact window. A third layer came from location data pulled off his department-issued phone, and a fourth arrived through a receipt and camera capture from a gas station where Harlan had met privately with a contractor long known to work under Crowe's protection. That contractor had approached Amos Carver months earlier demanding a so-called security consulting fee, which Amos had refused to pay on principle. Shortly after his arrest, Amos lost his largest contract, and that same contract was quietly reassigned to the very company whose fee he had declined. Elise Marin realized, standing in the doorway, that several arrests she had quietly doubted for years followed this identical pattern. The investigation that led Silas to Westbridge had not begun with Amos Carver at all, but with a routine review of complaint statistics that a junior analyst on Silas's team had flagged months earlier. The analyst noticed that arrests tied to narcotic possession in this particular precinct carried a conviction rate far higher than similar cities of comparable size. Yet, the appeals overturning those convictions were unusually frequent as well, a pattern that suggested something was being manufactured rather than discovered. Silas had spent months quietly building contact with people willing to speak, most of whom refused outright once they learned who might be listening on the other end of the conversation. Amos Carver was the first person willing to sign a formal statement, driven less by anger than by a stubborn insistence that his name be cleared regardless of the personal cost involved. He had filed several separate complaints with the department's Internal Affairs Division before Silas ever contacted him, each complaint dismissed within days for lack of supporting evidence. Evidence that Harlan and Crow had made certain never existed in any searchable form. It was Amos's persistence more than any single piece of evidence that convinced Silas the pattern was real and worth the months of careful work required to prove it in a courtroom rather than merely suspected in private. Crow continued performing surprise, insisting that Harlan had clearly been operating far outside any authority the department had given him. Harlan, furious now, snapped back that he had only ever carried out instructions he was given from above, refusing to accept the role of the lone offender Crow was trying to assign him. Crow's attorney moved quickly to stop him from saying anything further, but the damage to their alliance was already visible to everyone watching. Silas said nothing, letting the two men study each other in silence, aware that the growing distance between them would only make each one easier to break. Tessa then revealed that Harlan was never the only name listed on the search order, since Crow's personal accounts and 3 shell companies tied to him had already been frozen before Silas ever walked through the front doors that morning. For the first time all morning, Crow's composure cracked visibly when Silas placed a printed bank statement in front of him, bearing a transaction code linked directly to the Glasshouse file. Crow immediately requested his attorney and refused to answer further questions without counsel present. The city's own legal representative arrived soon after, arguing loudly that the federal lockdown had exceeded its lawful scope and threatening litigation against the agency involved. He insisted that an access log alone proved nothing about who had physically used any given account on any given night. Outside, local reporters began gathering near the perimeter of the building, drawn by rumors already spreading through the neighborhood. Crow saw an opportunity in the growing crowd and tried quietly to reframe the entire operation as federal overreach against a proud local department. A short video clip soon surfaced online showing only the moment Silas stood in the lobby just before Harlan's fist connected, stripped of the earlier footage where Silas had calmly presented his credentials. Viewed without context, the clip made Silas look like the aggressor, and many outside the building believed exactly that. Crow quietly encouraged a media consultant on his staff to keep the clip circulating as widely as possible. Harlan, buoyed by the sudden shift in public sentiment, regained some of his earlier confidence, certain the story outside would eventually save him. Tessa grew concerned that someone connected to the operation had leaked material to the press, and Silas asked the technical team to trace exactly where the clip had originated. Within minutes, they identified the device that first transmitted the footage, a department-issued tablet belonging to Crow's own communications consultant. Silas chose not to reveal this immediately, allowing Crow to keep lying in front of his attorney and the assembled witnesses a little longer. Crow stated firmly that no one from his office had contacted any member of the press that morning. Tessa responded by projecting the network data onto a screen, proving definitively that the clip had been transmitted from a device connected to the chief's private network. Elise had joined the Westbridge department years earlier, drawn by a genuine belief that steady, principled police work could change a struggling city block by block. She had watched Harlan rise through the ranks with a mixture of frustration and helplessness, reporting concerns through every proper channel available to her, only to see those reports quietly filed away or, worse, used later as leverage against her own career advancement. More than once, she had considered leaving the department entirely, applying for positions in neighboring counties where the politics felt less suffocating. But something had always kept her rooted in Westbridge, a stubborn conviction that walking away would only leave the department worse off than she had found it. Watching the lockdown unfold that morning, she felt something close to relief mixed uncomfortably with grief. Relief that the truth was finally surfacing, and grief for the years spent unable to force that truth into the open on her own. Elise Martin added that the lobby cameras had captured the entire encounter in full, including the moment Harlan refused to verify Silas's credentials and the punch that followed it. The unedited footage had already uploaded automatically to a secure city server the instant the lockdown began, placing it permanently beyond anyone's reach inside the building. Crow's attempt to shape public opinion had quietly become one more count of obstruction added to a file already growing heavier by the hour. Silas explained that his device had done more than trigger the locks that morning, since it had also issued an automatic preservation order covering every recording system in the building for several minutes before and after the strike, ensuring the full footage could never be erased or edited. While attention in the room remained fixed on the screen, Harlan slipped quietly out of the lobby and moved toward a secondary server room near the rear of the building. Harlan knew that room held an older recording unit that had never been migrated to the department's newer cloud system, one that still stored backup footage from the garage cameras, including several nights he had personally carried evidence out through that entrance. He used an emergency access card to force open the technical corridor. And although the lockdown logged his movement, it did not seal the emergency pathway since the system had been designed to keep people safe rather than trap them inside. Elise noticed his absence almost immediately and alerted Silas, who moved toward the server room with two federal agents at his side, none of them drawing a weapon since nothing about Harlan's behavior suggested a threat to anyone's life. They found him already prying the drive loose from its housing, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. Harlan claimed he was only trying to protect department property from being taken by outsiders who had no right to it. Silas asked him calmly to set the drive down on the nearest table. And when Harlan instead raised it as if to smash it against the floor, Elise stepped forward and pulled it from his grip before it could shatter. The confrontation ended quickly without injury, and Harlan offered no further resistance once the drive was secured. Silas told him plainly that the contents had already been copied hours earlier and that leaving the old server active had been a deliberate test to see who would try to reach it once the lockdown began. Harlan's decision to run for that room had just confirmed in front of witnesses that he knew precisely what incriminating material it contained. When the forensic team opened the recovered drive, they found footage of Harlan removing a sealed evidence bag from storage on the exact night Lena's log had flagged, along with a separate audio clip capturing Crow's voice, instructing him to, in his own words, teach Amos Carver a lesson about the cost of refusing to cooperate. Crow immediately claimed the recording had been taken out of context and edited to sound worse than it was. Lena produced a matching email showing Amos's contract reassigned to the favored company only days after his arrest, closing the gap Crow's attorney was trying to open. Harlan understood, watching his former chief scramble for an explanation, that Crow no longer had any intention of protecting him. He offered to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency, though Tessa made no promises in return, reminding him that cooperation would be weighed carefully against the severity of what he had already done. From the dusty hallway, they were moved into the chief's own conference room for the remainder of the questioning, a room with dark paneling and a long table where Crow had once hosted budget meetings with city council members and handshake photographs with visiting dignitaries. The irony was not lost on Elise, who stood near the door and watched two men who had shared that table for years now refuse to look directly at each other. Crow's attorney tried repeatedly to have the session moved elsewhere, arguing that continuing inside department property tainted the proceedings. But Tessa reminded him that a federal search order controlled the building until she said otherwise. Harlan sat with his hands folded tightly in front of him, occasionally glancing toward the door as though some rescue might still arrive if he simply waited long enough. Crow, by contrast, kept his composure like a man rehearsing a speech he had given many times before, choosing his words with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years believing his position made him untouchable. Crow turned on his sergeant openly now, calling him a liar who was trying to drag an innocent chief down with him out of pure desperation. Harlan, with nothing left to protect, began describing private meetings, unmarked cash payments, and verbal instructions he had received over the years, each detail delivered with growing bitterness. Tessa reminded everyone present that testimony alone meant little without independent verification, and Silas remained unhurried since his team had already assembled corroborating evidence from several separate channels. Federal financial investigators traced payments from favored contractors flowing through a supposed police support fund before landing in a company quietly registered under the name of Crow's brother-in-law. The business owners Harlan had targeted over the years shared one consistent trait, each having refused to sign contracts with that same small circle of favored contractors. Amos Carver's case offered the clearest chain of evidence among them, but Tessa's team confirmed he was far from the only victim caught in the same pattern. Elise Marin handed over internal memos she had written years earlier, warning Crow directly about irregularities in Harlan's conduct, memos that had apparently gone nowhere. Those documents proved Crow had received explicit warnings long before he promoted Harlan further within the department. In the margin of one memo, Crow had written that Harlan knew how to handle difficult cases, a note that now read very differently than it likely had at the time. Lena confirmed that after nearly every serious complaint, she had personally received instructions to adjust the timestamps on evidence intake logs. A handful of younger officers, watching the case collapse around them, began voluntarily surrendering their phones and offering statements without being asked twice. Silas made a clear distinction between officers who had actively participated in the scheme and those who had simply stayed silent out of fear, though he was careful to note that silence still carried its own weight and its own consequences. Elise asked every remaining officer to cooperate fully, and in a gesture meant to remove any appearance of conflict, she voluntarily stepped back from her own command of the patrol division until the investigation concluded. There had been a time, years earlier, when Crow genuinely believed he was building something worth protecting. A department that could modernize itself while keeping the old loyalties that had always run through Westbridge like a second set of veins. Somewhere along the way, that belief had curdled into something else. A conviction that the rules existed only for people who lacked the connections to rise above them. He had told himself more than once that the contractors he protected brought jobs and investment into a city that badly needed both. A story that let him ignore exactly how those contracts were secured and exactly who paid the price when someone refused to play along. Crow watched Harlan unravel across the table from him. Crow understood for the first time in years that the story he had been telling himself no longer held any weight outside the walls of this building. Crow, watching his authority evaporate room by room, finally seemed to grasp that not a single person left in the building still answered to him. Tessa announced that a federal judge had signed Crow's arrest warrant that same morning, well before Silas had ever walked through the front doors, and that her team had deliberately delayed serving it in order to observe his behavior and gather one final act of obstruction on the record. Silas set a pair of handcuffs on the table in front of Crow and told him quietly that he had spent the entire morning with a chance to cooperate and had chosen instead to spend it trying to erase the evidence against himself. Harlan was formally arrested on charges of assaulting a federal officer, obstruction, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to violate civil rights, while Crow faced charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, contract fraud, and conspiracy to destroy evidence. Several additional officers were suspended pending further review of their own conduct during the period the operation had documented. Elise Marin was placed in temporary charge of securing the building, though every record, drive, and piece of physical evidence remained firmly under federal control. As the lockdown formally ended, the lights above each doorway shifted one by one from red back to green, unlocking the building floor by floor. Outside, the gathered reporters had expected a loud, chaotic confrontation, but instead watched Crow and Harlan led out through the front entrance in near total silence. Harlan looked at Silas as he passed and insisted once more that the punch had only been a single mistake made in a moment of poor judgment. Silas answered that the punch had not created the man standing in front of him. It had simply shown everyone in that lobby who he had always been. Harlan asked, almost bewildered, why Silas had never struck back even once. Silas told him he had never needed to win a fistfight against one angry sergeant, only to make certain that sergeant could never again do what he had done to an innocent person. Amos's daughter stood beside him near the barricade, a young woman who had spent the past year watching her father lose sleep over a case he could not prove, and a company he feared he might never rebuild. She had been the one who kept pushing him to file another complaint every time the department dismissed the last one, refusing to let him give up on the idea that persistence eventually mattered. Watching the two men in handcuffs led past the cameras, she said nothing at first, simply reaching for her father's hand, the way she had when she was a child waiting outside a courtroom for news that never seemed to come soon enough. Silas noticed the two of them from a distance and felt, not triumph exactly, but the particular quiet satisfaction of watching a very long process finally reach the moment it was always supposed to reach. Tessa asked whether he wanted to be examined at a hospital before continuing with the paperwork, and Silas requested only a bag of ice, then returned to signing the evidence intake forms stacked on the counter. He walked out through the same front doors that had sealed shut earlier, now standing wide open, while behind him, Harlan's badge sat inside a clear evidence bag on a folding table near the intake desk. On the far side of the perimeter, Amos Carver stood waiting quietly among the small crowd, offering no cheer and no celebration. Only a single question about whether the truth would actually hold his time or simply fade the way it had after his own arrest years earlier. Months later, Crow and Harlan both appeared before a federal hearing to answer for what the evidence had ultimately shown. Harlan accepted a conditional cooperation agreement, though it did not erase his direct responsibility for the actions he had personally carried out over the years. Crow tried repeatedly to place the full weight of the scheme on his former sergeant, but the financial records, internal emails, and access logs made it impossible to separate him from the operation he had quietly commanded from behind his desk. Amos Carver's case was dismissed entirely, his record cleared of every charge that had once cost him his reputation and nearly a year of his freedom. The city agreed to compensate Amos along with several other victims during the course of the investigation. Amos used part of the settlement to rebuild his electrical contracting business, though what mattered most to him was seeing his name publicly and formally cleared. Dozens of older cases connected to Harlan were reopened for review, some resulting in convictions being overturned entirely. The Westbridge Department was ordered to adopt an independent evidence management system, regular camera audits, and an outside review process for civilian complaints going forward. Lena Pierce left her old position and moved into a role with the Civilian Oversight Office, continuing the kind of quiet documentation work that had first broken the case open. Elise Marin was named acting chief, but only agreed to accept the role on the condition that she be given full authority to rebuild the department's internal affairs division from the ground up. Silas declined every invitation to appear on television as the agent who brought down a police department, preferring instead to let the paperwork speak for itself. He returned to his office once his lip had fully healed, placing the watch that had triggered the lockdown into a drawer beside several others collected from earlier cases. Tessa asked him one afternoon whether it felt satisfying watching every door in that building lock at once. Silas told her the meaning of that morning was never really the doors. It was the moment the people trapped inside finally understood they no longer controlled what the truth was going to say about them. Before leaving Westbridge for good, Silas stopped to see Amos one final time, and when Amos thanked him for what he had done, Silas reminded him that it was Amos's own refusal to stop filing complaints even after being dismissed again and again that had truly set the investigation in motion. In the months that followed, the changes inside the Westbridge department moved slower than anyone would have liked. But they moved. Officers who had stayed silent out of fear rather than complicity were given the chance to testify under protective agreements, and several did, describing years of quiet pressure to look away from irregularities they had noticed but never dared question aloud. The city council, embarrassed by the scope of what the investigation revealed, approved funding for the independent oversight office where Lena Pierce now worked, giving her the kind of authority she had once been forced to exercise in secret. Elise Marin spent her first months as acting chief simply rebuilding trust with a community that had every reason to doubt the department's word, holding open forums in neighborhoods that had rarely seen a police official show up without a badge leading the conversation. Amos Carver occasionally stopped by those forums himself, not to speak usually, but simply to be seen sitting in the audience as proof that the system could, under enough pressure, correct itself. Silas kept in touch with almost none of them once the case closed, not out of coldness, but because he had learned long ago that his presence in a rebuilding city was a reminder of trauma as much as a symbol of justice. And the people of Westbridge deserved the chance to move forward without a federal agent standing in every photograph. The story closed with Silas accepting a new case file involving a different department in another city entirely, tucking it under his arm as he pulled on his plain jacket and picked up the same unremarkable leather case he always carried. He had learned long ago never to correct people who mistook his quiet manner for a lack of power, since that mistake, made again and again by men like Harlan and Crow, was often the very thing that handed him the evidence he needed. There would be another Westbridge somewhere down the road, another department convinced its own reputation made it untouchable. And Silas understood that the work of proving otherwise rarely announced itself with sirens or flashing lights. It happened instead in the quiet accumulation of logs and patient conversations with people brave enough to speak when almost everyone around them had chosen silence. He walked out looking like exactly the kind of man that arrogant people would keep underestimating right up until the moment it cost them everything they thought they controlled. Vance Harlan had once believed that a badge gave him the right to lock anyone he chose behind a cell door. On the morning his own arrogance caught up with him, it was he who ended up locked inside a building with nothing left but the evidence he had spent years trying to bury.